displaced by settler colonialism. Performative and inadequate as this acknowledgement may be, we could not talk about modern displacement without recalling the displacement of the original inhabitants of this very land. Just as a recap, the first event of the seminar series that will soon be available on our website, so stay tuned, kicked it off with an incredible overview of the EU and US border regimes, looking at the historical perspectives, at the current trends and policies of border externalization. It was then followed by a 2-day bilingual event at the Rio Grande Valley, where activists, artists, scholars, and practitioners came together to share their work in the field of migration and forced displacement, from the perspective of the incredible place that is the borderland of the valley, which we're going to talk about today. Today, we look at migration from a perspective that is often overlooked, despite migration being a process, a journey, and it is the journey itself. Policies of externalization have a huge impact on the decisions that migrants make along the way, as well as on their journey and their experience in general. This session will address the impact of externalization on routes, border towns, and everyday life of migrants, as well as their hosts and activists in the area. So without further ado, let me welcome our esteemed panelists today. Azra Hromajic, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Syracuse University. Noel Bridgen, Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University. Rachel Nolan, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Boston University. Katia Blanchini, Fellow at the Max Planck Institute of Anthropology, and Eric Ridey, Editor at the New Humanitarian. So while we get this started, I would like to welcome the people who are with us in person to grab a bite and a coffee. And I would like to remind the people who are on Zoom to ask their questions in the chat box so that we can read them later for the discussion. So Professor Hromajic, the floor is yours.
I already know this is a successful event when the introducer can pronounce my last name. That never happens. I'm almost speechless. So thank you so much, Isabella, and thank you for everyone for inviting me here. I'm honored to be here, and what a wonderful center you have. I have 10 minutes. I think I'll probably cover 2 of my 13 slides, so I'm happy to finish talking in the Q&A session. I don't study migration, but I did write a piece about migration that kind of propelled me into the space of thinking migration more so than I ever anticipated. But this is what happens when you are an ethnographer and you are doing research, and then the world around you changes. Things collapse and open up in a way that articulates something new about the world that we maybe still do not have grammar to think with. So that's how I come to the question of migration, through just being in the field when the so-called migrant crisis happened in Europe and arrived and articulated itself in my hometown and my research site. So I'll just very quickly say what I would like to do, but as I said, I don't think I'll be able to go through all of these. So I'm going to quickly introduce this Bosnian town that became a hotspot on the Balkan migrant route in 2018, that I have been studying different social formations since 2013. I'm going to quickly talk about global apartheid and security imperialism, and Bihać, my hometown and my research site, emerging as one of the main nodes in these new formations of migratory forces and violences that are changing the way that geographies are experienced and lived. I'm going to focus especially, and this is where my passion is and where my I think intellectual energy comes from, on a couple of ethnographic articulations or ethnographic moments in which some of these new social formations that bring together people in town, the ethnographer who is also semi-local, and the people on the move together as they have to coexist. Often in tension, but also in solidarity with each other. So I'm going to zoom into a couple of these ethnographic moments, and then I'll conclude. That's in the ideal world, not the world of 10 minutes. Okay, so this is the Balkan migrant route. It's changing now. I don't have time to go into the most recent configurations of it, but my hometown is Bihać. It's here, right? It's located right here on the map. I'm circling it. I hope you can see it. So as I said, since 2018, it became the newest hotspot on the so-called Balkan migrant route. While waiting to cross into the European Union, migranti, as they're locally referred to, have to manage everyday living with people in town. By the way, Bihać is one of the places that during the Bosnian War, those of you who maybe remember it, was one of the places that was besieged. So in itself, the place in itself is still recovering from its own very difficult war history, as well as refuginess that war history produced. So many of the people who live in town today were refugees themselves, which also complicates these new so-called migrant encounters. So I think about Bihać as a site of contingent circulation. So it's not as a bounded territory, or how I think about this contingent circulation is a node that's produced through these intersecting moving pathways where objects and subjects and bodies and souls come together and articulate with each other, however temporarily. And I'm using articulation here in Stuart Hall's sense of things that come together. They don't necessarily belong together, but they're kind of producing something together, right, in a temporary moment. I happen to be in the field, as I said, and I hate the notion of the field because it's other people's homes and souls that we refer to through this notion of the field, but I don't have a better term, so I'm using it in quotation marks, where I was witnessing yet another transformation of Bihać, and Bihać has been transforming during the war, during socialism greatly, during the Bosnian War, and then in the post-war reconstruction period, which is now very much labeled by extractive green capitalism. I'm writing a book about what I called riverine citizenship and forms of capitalist, environmentalist extractions in the region. So this was very uncanny. When I arrived to Bihać in 2018, it felt very visceral, very personal. It felt almost as if I myself, a migrant of sorts by choice, found myself displaced in the place that I call home. And it felt like deja vu in so many ways and novelty at the same time. It was such a dislocating moment where similarities and incongruences collapsed and created, as I said, this new place that we all try to navigate and make sense of. So refugees, migrants, bodies, souls, journalists, politicians, projects, experts, researchers, everyone started coming to Bihać. Bihać became a hot spot, not only on the Balkan migrant route, but also on the researchers route and EU grant money route. So there was a lot of money and expertise that was coming in big numbers in Bihać. The goal was to grasp these multiple and intimate encounters between the people of Bihać, migranti, and myself, migrant of sorts. So it's a triple kind of braided migration. So I call it here I name it here triple migration, converging in ways that challenge what we and how we know, and also how and what we feel. So very quickly, I don't have much time to go because I think you want to, how many minutes do I have? 7? 7, okay. Okay, so this notion of global apartheid, this is more of a potential kind of a theoretical way of thinking about it, and how to connect these nodes, where Bihać becomes a node that I am zooming into, but how, you know, it's not an isolated node. These nodes are in so many ways reconfiguring geopolitics and reconfiguring the way that people live. So global apartheid, I'm here building on Catherine Besteman's really wonderful book, which looks at the relationship between the so-called North and South as assemblages of power, ideology, surveillance, and technology through which the global North regulates, racializes, polices migranti and others from the global South. So Bihać becomes one node, as I said, in this security imperialism formation that complicates the North-South, center, periphery, and state region global apartheid framework. I felt that none of these kind of center periphery models of thinking, or North-South, while power is real, the way these new formations were articulating themselves was challenging these dualistic ways of looking at the world, north, south, internal, external. I felt things were collapsing in a way that I didn't know what kind of analytic grammar to use to capture it. And it's still my struggle. So Bihać then for me becomes more than a location or node on the map. It becomes a place, a dynamic web of practices and material forces, which captures what this global apartheid and its regimes of technological surveillance feel like, look like, sound like, and move like in everyday life. So I wanted to ask myself, what kind of ethnography can capture this? What kind of ethnography can take these encounters seriously and situate it within these larger formations? And I started writing essays. I couldn't even write academic articles. I was prone to, I wanted to write poetry. I was just looking for new genre of how to articulate what I was seeing, and I'm still searching. So I wrote an essay, and that's why I'm here, I think, because that essay kind of gathered some traction among the people interested in these processes. Again, I don't study usually migration, but I'm now beginning. So here are a couple of these articulations that I capture in that piece, and a couple of them I'm now starting to unpack a new one. I don't have time to talk about that one in this particular presentation. So the first ones are these war articulations. So what happens a lot is that people in Bihać, who are native from Bihać, many of whom, as I said, were refugees in Germany during the Bosnian War, both expressed solidarity and distance. They would say, we know what it's like. We were refugees too. We understand migranti. We understand them, but we also wish them gone. And this is one of these contradictions. How do you express this, understanding for the so-called sea of humanity, suffering sea of humanity, without paying attention to individual migrant history? Very rarely are they invited to tell their story, but they are sympathized with as a sea of humanity. So where are these, how are these contradictions kind of expressing themselves? One is that you see these two migranti taking a nap in the former still it is a graveyard from the partisan Second World War partisan movement, and those soldiers from Bihać who died during that time. There's a memorial to them, and this is where migranti, when I talk a certain kinds of bodily kind of bone-to-bone relationship to this soil that's emerging. Such a historical contradiction. It is in the place where the heroes of the World War II partisan movement sleep, that migranti are taking rest, often oblivious to these kind of histories. But this is what I try to capture, right? These things that if you don't know local history, you would never know what's happening. So migranti took naps and rested next to these graves, creating novel historical intimacies and layers of bones and flesh, cement and grass, visible and invisible names, lives, and deaths. The other moment of this kind of contradiction is when one migrant, as I'm using the term that locals use for the people who are forced to move, that he was wearing a Srebrenica shirt, that Srebrenica site of genocide in Bosnia. He was wearing a shirt that said "Never forget Srebrenica," and that kind of moment of that shirt collapsing on the body or intimately connecting to the body of the migrant became so overwhelming, unbearable, and dystopic almost. It created the limit, the existential, the methodological, the semantic. I didn't know what to do with the shirt and the migrant wearing shirt in that moment. The second, so I have many examples of wars kind of layering and collapsing into one another in a way that challenge our understanding of movement. The second one is environment and nature, and they became another site of these convergences. So the majority of migranti spent their time by the famous Una River. I'm writing a book about the Una River, so my daughter is called Una. It's not an accident. I'm very much in love with the river, as most of the city. And the Una River became for migranti a source of hygiene and possibility, moments of joy. I have a piece about war and joy that I recently published. So this is in my head as I was writing this. So there was this rumor that the migranti were eating river ducks, and river ducks are pets, right? It was through these ducks and through nature that many of these tensions were being expressed and articulated. The second one is this, that migrants were using actually part by the path by the river to release, to defecate, and people were constantly commented how this used to be Put Avnoje, which is like this modernist Titoist project of connecting Bihać to Sarajevo, how it now became the road of shit. So it's this, again, through this kind of the ruinous industrial post-socialist past that some of these tensions around infrastructure, about belonging, are being articulated. One of my favorite was also Borići, was one of the refugee camps in Bihać that, and here you have the pictures of Boric, and here is the makeshift camp right here. Here is here are trees in Boric camp. There is a structure right behind it, as if I think you can see, which was a dorm for high school students who were coming before the war, who were coming to study in Bihać from elsewhere. And now it's a camp, and all these trees were actually forested by us, elementary school students, and now many of these trees are big, and people have this intimate connection to them. However, Migranti had to use the trees to start fire and to warm themselves during, because some of them only had tents. So these trees started to lose their bark. And seeing these pictures, with now knowing this, and oftentimes people refer to these trees as the lungs of town and the city, right? They're very important for health and well-being of Bihać. So one person came up to me seeing this picture and said, "Are these pine beetles?" And that kind of articulation, this question literally collapsed the boundary between the human and non-human, where Migranti and invasive others collapsed into one dangerous category. So there were other constant slippages like that. I'm working on one of them who talked about Migranti as flamingos, like exotic birds from elsewhere, right? So this human and non-human slippages become another site of exclusion. The third one, I don't think I have much time left, but the third one are these infrastructural articulations. I wrote a piece about how this nursing home that was never completed, it was started to be built during the socialist times, then the war started, it was never completed. So it was imagined as a place where, socialist workers would retire nicely by the Una River, they would take their daily walks. This never happened because the war started and the building was not finished. And then immediately after the war, youth reoccupied that, they took the place and they started hanging out. So this unfinished building, instead of its imagined inhabitants, elderly socialist workers who were going to age and die in it peacefully, has been housing and co-producing first transitions, disillusioned Bosnian youth, and most recently Migranti. So this became one of the main buildings that Migranti in Bihać could use, and many of them ended up dying because the building is not secure, and they ended up falling into the lift shaft, and so there was a lot of danger. So, and here's the building, you see it in the background by the Una River. It's unfinished building right there. Another one is the place of culture, also socialist building, never completed, that's now becoming this climbing gym for Migranti and locals. Imagine again, in a very advanced school of cultural capitalism, it would be kind of almost a place to entertain the Migranti, a place for entertainment, which I'm writing about that now, so I'm not ready to discuss it in depth. I'm going to skip over this one, this political articulations where people feel neglected by Sarajevo, by this capital, and they felt very much alone, being caught as this nod. I will say a little bit that some of these articulations of not being cared for, being stuck, being kind of in the new geopolitical formation on the boundary of the EU, both included and excluded in so many ways, included through surveillance, excluded through many other forms of violences, is referred to as Bosnian Gaza. And to me, this was really interesting that many people address this hypocritical nature of European care and EU politics of armed love where care replaces cure as European Gaza Strip. And I invite us to think about Gaza in quotation marks as places in the world besieged by palpable militarized borders where contemporary, local, and elsewhere human and non-human waste is dumped, monitored, attempted to be depoliticized, kept as labor reserve, and contained. So that's another articulation. Next articulation, I have two more. So one is sports articulations. I'm sorry, am I out?
It's okay, no, we're finished.
Okay, just two more. So the sports articulation. So the migrants, what they attempt to do, Bihać is at the border of with Croatia, they attempt to go into what they call the game. The game means to cross the big mountain that's still populated by landmines from the recent war. And they call it a game. So if they can cross the migrant, their game is the mountain, their game is successful. Right? They cross into Croatia, and if there is no pushback, they sometimes stay in Croatia and then hopefully move on. However, at the same time, they also watched many soccer games because one of the camps is very close to the soccer game. So soccer stadium next to this Eon-run migrant camp became really a new site of local people and migranti coming together in supporting the local team, which sucks, by the way. Okay, that's so bad. But we all came, and they came together and they supported it, oftentimes right before their game. So here they are, at the game and then going into the game. This is them getting ready to go into the game. So they were using the same. However, what's interesting is that they were using the same route that people used during the Bosnian War to try to escape the siege. So again, these kind of very different violences and experiences of game were, layering with each other. So this comment to me said by one person, look, they're going into the game and they're crossing illegally into Croatia the same way that we tried to escape the siege, collapsed and articulated the time geography between the two events, where refugees near and far blended into a sea of walking humanity, the so-called human flow, seemingly without history. Finally, necropolitical articulations. Here is a landfill that was active landfill during the socialist times. It's not active anymore, overwhelmed by absence of care from the EU and Sarajevo. The local mayor decided to move Migranti to this former landfill on the border with Croatia in the mountain. And this became such a site of local outcry. People were upset that this is how humans were treated. Interestingly, this camp is called Vučjak. Etymologically, Vuk comes from wolves, connoting a daunting space where wilderness and animals dominate over humans. This is 6 miles out of the city. The people were oftentimes taken in prison-like formation by foot up there, dehumanized, suspended in time and place, sleeping and waiting on tons of toxic garbage that was hidden under the surface, surrounded by still unexplored landmines. And one person did die stepping on a landmine from the most recent war. And there were 3 explosions since the war ended in that area from the landmines, and they were encircled by wolves. This heavy human activity on top of the landfill produced untreated human waste, obviously, where feces and garbage were starting to seep into the porous karstic soil. So it took only a day for these toxins to travel underground to reach the main freshwater spring in the town called Klokot, that ironically is circling now back into the bodies of local people. So this is another one of these contradictions and these kind of intimate relationships. So conclusion. What I mean by these articulations, I'm thinking about these lives displaced, my own, the migranti, the refugees in the city, how we were all brought together, locals, migrants, and myself, as these articulations were unfolded into one of these nodes, produced through historic encounters among post-colonialisms, post-wars, post-socialism, and militarized global apartheid. New grammars and ways of living together were being expressed in everyday life, and they were constantly in tension with each other. They revealed the viscosity of race and class, solidarity of religion and war experience, and articulations of these tensions via war, nature, culture, infrastructure, sports, protest, and games. There's no good analytical apparatus, at least I don't have it, to grasp these emerging, converging, and swollen sociopolitical, geopolitical, and affective articulations and ways of being and surviving in the world. It's still waiting to be named, this what I'm talking about. Thus, for now, notes from the notes. Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
All right, I am presenting a paper that is co-authored. Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
There's a camera.
There's a camera.
Yeah.
Okay. I am presenting a paper that is co-authored with Chetta Mainwaring, and this takes stock of a conversation that began about a decade ago in 2013, when we began to compare notes Me from fieldwork along the Central American migration route across Mexico and into the United States, and Cheta working in the Mediterranean. And we heard so many echoes between the experiences of people making these very different crossings that it led to an edited volume and a paper that we wrote called Beyond the Border: Clandestine Migration Journeys. We called it Beyond the Border because we were rebelling against the idea that the border was the principal site of policing and danger during journeys. And so we wanted to think about migration routes as spatialized packages of human practice that are sustained over time. And we thought about journeys as tapping into the experiential element of the passages through those routes and in those routes. In that work, to review briefly, we offered some cautions about the potential for co-optation, complicity, ethical problems, and the securitization of the research on migrant routes. And we also noted briefly that the roots of the study of routes itself comes from the interest of the state in externalizing its policing regime to thwart the journeys of asylum seekers on the outskirts of Europe, and then in the United States as well, with that externalization of migration policing to Mexico and other countries. We were also drawing attention, however, not only to externalization, but internalization, the way that entire nation states become bordered, and looking to understand what the study of the borderlands can now teach us about the entirety of the territorial space of the nation state. And we argued that we really needed cross-regional comparative research on migrant journeys. And we talked about how this would lead to insights about migrant agency, the recreation and creation of meaning and root and narratives and identities, and the lived experience of uncertainty and violence that unfolds in this process. And so this paper that we've now co-authored takes stock after a decade of work on what's taken place in the literature since that time. And back in 2013, when we began these conversations, we would often reflect that things couldn't possibly get any worse. And we were really, really wrong. And this brings us to a concept that we've already talked about today with global apartheid. I want to draw our attention to the fact that the installations of global apartheid are fire prone, and increasingly so. So if you look back in 2012 in Honduras, you see a prison fire where a record-setting 362 people died. At least 100 of those people died still locked within their cells. And the brunt of the blame for this fire was borne by the prisoners themselves, who the state implicated in its beginning. In Venezuela in 2018, 68 prisoners died in a criminal prison. And both of these fires occur in the context of mass exodus accelerating from these nation states. These are not migrants who died in these fires, but the people left behind by migration, experiencing the most profound form of immobility possible. And so then in 2020, we have the fire of the Moria in Lesbos, the refugee camp. No one died, but 13,000 people were displaced from the camp itself. And many people encountered vigilante mobs and other blockades when they tried to access shelter. And then, of course, very, very recently, approximately 40 people have died from the Ciudad Juarez fire in the immigrant detention facility. And it is no coincidence that among those, there are at least 13 Hondurans and 12 Venezuelans. These processes of detention are deeply linked within that concept, or within that structure of global apartheid. So the carceral landscape has become so extreme that it's time for us to ask if studying migrant journeys or migration makes sense. Is that really what we're studying in this context? And so our paper looks at a decade of intensified criminalization, policing, and death, and the ways that scholars who study migration journeys have tried to cope with that context of what Lloyd, Mitchelson, and Burge call walls and cages, what Walia says is a shared logic of immobilization and spatial carcerality. Does it make sense to talk about mobility? Do journeys continue to provide a useful analytical lens, methodological focal point, or capture an experience of migration as we understand it? So we took stock of the literature that's emerged. We looked at the ways that that early work that we were in a critical literature on journeys rebelled against that focus between sending and destination states. And with it, rejected the idea that journeys could be understood as linear or certain kinds of movement. We also thought that journeys would help us question certain key binaries about migrant, refugee, here, there, victim, villain, legal, illegal, state, non-state, if you could actually follow in the footsteps of everyday people. And now we're seeing really exciting work come out. However, it tends to dwell on containment, migrant removal, and political contestation, as opposed to that early journey work that really did look more at the mobility of people through a transnational corridor. So we also see that migrant journeys has bridged migration studies and refugee studies in really fruitful ways. And then finally, we see these exciting dialogues emerging between migration studies and carceral studies, deportation studies, and social movements. And the concept, the analytical frame of journeys still provides an important bridge between these literatures in a variety of ways. So we went and reviewed the 10 years of literature that has taken place since that time, and we came up with 3 conceptual frames where we see really fruitful research happening on journeys. One is abandonment. So looking at the ways that governments have abandoned their responsibilities to asylum seekers, thereby creating deportation as an integral part of the journey itself for everyone, not just labor migrants. And then thinking about transnational homelessness, and there's been work on that as well. Abeyance as a temporal suspension. There's wonderful, rich literature that looks at the way migration control manipulates time and waiting. And we see that has been a really fruitful place for journeys to go and think about. And then, of course, accompaniment. So among human rights advocates, accompaniment is really a strategic and ethical position of shared risk through physical proximity to other people. It comes laden with lots of contradictions as well in that practice, but nevertheless, thinking about it as a material and reflexive form of witnessing and testimonial has been a fruitful place where a lot of this work on journeys goes. And we'll hear more about that in terms of the politics of humanitarian work and its complexity. And I think that's been a really rich source of understanding since we wrote the original paper. And so our answer to that question, is it still worthwhile to think about journeys, is, well, maybe we didn't get beyond borders, but instead we have bordered journeys that we're looking at. And that, yes, global apartheid in particular is interrupting our methodological access to the routes that people travel. It's very difficult to access detention facilities, deportation planes, and so forth, to be able to kind of follow in the footsteps of everyday people, increasingly so. And in fact, when we first held a workshop that led to that edited volume in 2014, one of the things that we noted was that nobody in the room was actually studying the state, because we didn't have access, not because we hadn't tried. And it was easier for me to interview someone being smuggled on top of a train clandestinely, to access that clandestine route, than to access the legal route of the state back again through the detention facilities. And that's not an accident. Emma Goldman once quipped about voting that if voting actually did anything, they'd make it illegal. If research on journeys actually did anything, they would make it illegal. So where it's illegal, that is a really fruitful place for us to start looking in creative ways. Now, and for one of those reasons, I've actually moved away from migration studies into other kinds of work as well, that I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, where my research trajectory, my own intellectual journey has gone since we wrote this paper, but in some ways a reaction to the complicity I see with exposing clandestine journeys. All right, nevertheless, research that follows in the footsteps of migrants can reveal how their lives and experiences continue to subvert a politicized discourse that attempts to contain them. So even where people never cross a border, they're challenged to the language of the border. Their challenge to that politics, nevertheless, is still very important, and journeys can provide us with a structure for our research and our narratives to be able to do that. And so as an analytical lens, critically deployed and carefully deployed, journeys can still unravel easy binaries that structure global apartheid. And that is where we finished.
Wow, this is really seamless. Thank you guys so much. I'm Rachel. I'm going to follow these amazing presentations. I'm seeing some old friends in the room that I haven't seen since before the pandemic. Oh, too bad. So I want to talk about something that takes us beyond the settler border states that often frame migration studies. And the work that I'm starting to do now is plugging into the two people we've heard from thus far in some really interesting ways that I'm going to try to highlight as well. So as many people in the room may know, but the wider public in the United States tends not to, the vast majority of Guatemalan migrants who come to the United States are indigenous. So they speak one of 22 languages. Let me just pull up a map. Again, this room is probably better educated on these issues than most other groups that I speak to. So where I do my research is in Guatemala, similar to what Azra was describing. I didn't start out studying migration. I'm a historian. I was studying the history of international adoption, which I later learned sociologists refer to as the quiet migration. I was studying it in adoption files as a historian, as a war crime, right? Like as the forcible displacement and disappearance of children. So that meant that I started living in Guatemala in 2014, just at the time that the so-called unaccompanied minors crisis kicked off in the United States. And so Guatemala was one of the three most important countries from which unaccompanied minors were departing, along with El Salvador and Honduras, the so-called Northern Triangle. So Guatemala is the country where I was living, and similar to what Azura was describing, I mean, most of us who were living there got swept up in trying to explain what was happening while resisting the kind of researcher path that you so beautifully described. Those kinds of knowledges about the people who are on the move are too often used in the way that Noelle was describing in order to try to get people to stay put, right? The United States Embassy in Guatemala is an overwhelming presence. If you go to the indigenous highlands, I'll show you guys a photo of Todos Santos Cuchumatan, where I'm starting research now. I'm fine. Oh, I'm supposed to look into the camera. Hello, internet. Yeah. Oh dear. Uh-oh.
I made it worse.
No, there we go. There it is. If you go to the highlands, what you will hear is messages broadcast on the radio in one of the 22 indigenous languages that I mentioned, in Mam, which is spoken in Todos Santos Cuchumatan, telling people to stay put, to the background of marimba music, right? Which is the local music, telling people that that the journey is too unsafe for their children, you need to stay, et cetera, and so forth. So we know, those of us who are scholars, and I also work as a journalist, we know that whatever research we create is read at the US Embassy and sort of used in this effort. So I really appreciated the kind of care with which some of my fellow presenters were mentioning that. And it's something that I'm wary of myself as I embark on this new project. So I've just finished the book on international adoption. And again, because this was staring me in the face and I was trying to think, okay, what parts of this journey are illegal? What parts of this journey are we not supposed to know about? We're not allowed to be on deportation flights, and people who are deported from the United States are generally not followed when they return to their home. So when I was looking at the literature and the kind of public understanding of deportation, there are some wonderful scholars who are working on deportation. So I don't want to say that this is an original idea. I'm building on their work, but I thought, okay, maybe there's a way in which we can follow indigenous deportation to try to get a better understanding of the parts of the story that the US government is not so readily making available to us. So this is really preliminary research that I'm presenting to you today, and I just wanted to kind of raise awareness of the issue. We've been talking about global apartheid. I want to talk about apartheid in country, right? So communities that are still living significant discrimination. And from my perspective as a historian, connect that to some of the genocidal violence in Guatemala in the 1980s. So I'll just do that briefly and then to be part of this conversation. I will say that indigenous activists within Guatemala are discussing two different kinds of rights. One is the right to move, right? One is the right to migrate. The other is the right, so el derecho a migrar. Another that's oftenly discussed, and I'll say I'm a Spanish speaker, I'm not a Mam speaker, I'm not a Quiche speaker, I'm not a Hanjobal speaker, so I'm using the expertise of interpreters with some of this new project that I'm embarking on as I try to learn basic Mam, right, which is a really difficult language. This is something that linguists study in great depth because of the richness of its grammar and so forth. It's a really difficult and beautiful language. So what activists are talking about, if it were translated into Spanish, would be the right to migrate, which is at the bottom, but also the right not to migrate, el derecho a no migrar. So people who want to stay in their home communities, but for reasons of racial discrimination, climate change is a big issue in a lot of the areas that are seeing drought and coffee rust that affect corn production, which is the major subsistence crop, and also coffee, which is the major agro export. And another thing that indigenous communities are asking for, as in some activist formations, is el buen vivir, or a kind of human flourishing is maybe how you would translate that into English, meaning people want the circumstances in order to be able to live their lives in their home community, right? And as many people in the room know, you don't leave your community unless something is chasing you out. And even so, we need to account for those who are unable to leave, right? And who are kind of frozen in place. So what does this look like on the ground in Guatemala? There are a lot of communities in the kind of highlands area. If I just go back to the map, this is, oh, I'm not supposed to move, I'm frozen to the spot myself. The kind of, that top bit is jungle, so the Petén is jungle, but the kind of lower bit that extends toward Mexico is known as the highlands, because it's a mountainous region where a lot of these indigenous communities live. For those who are less familiar with Guatemala, it's roughly half of the population. So together with Peru or Bolivia, this is one of the countries in Latin America that has the highest indigenous population. As I said, there are 22 languages. There are also dialects, sub-dialects. These are each mutually indistinguishable languages with their own rich grammar. And so that's something that has become an issue in the US immigration system as well, in terms of language access when people are presenting asylum claims. So I'll get to that as well, because that's sort of what drew me into this issue. But this is a town that I've had the opportunity to return to several times, Todos Santos, Cuchumatan, which is a mom-speaking town in the highlands of Guatemala, where the vast majority of men of age, meaning over the age of 14, really, migrate to the United States. And women are starting to migrate in larger numbers along with children as well. That's a historic change in the last 10 years or so. And so what you're seeing are so-called remittance houses, where people use the money earned in the United States to build homes for their family members back in Todos Santos, and will often kind of paint the American flag on the houses as a recognition of where the money is coming from. The paper store in town is called La Papelería California. Most of the people are migrating to California, often in the kind of Bay Area or Central Valley, and working in agriculture there. So just to give you a sense of the kind of visual disconnect between families who have members who've managed to migrate safely to the United States and those who haven't. In the background, you see some kind of more shack-like homes, which is where people who don't have family members in the US might have to live. And then in the kind of middle ground, you can see a remittance house. And these are photographs taken by Mauricio Lima for the New York Times. So you can just see visually why people might be prompted in the community to want to go, right? This lady is wearing the traje, the hand-woven clothing that's visually identified with indigenous people in Guatemala. Another really important reminder in the community, and I took this photograph, is in the cemetery. So this is the photograph of someone who died in the United States and whose remains were brought back at great expense and with great difficulty. That's something that's not often talked about by the community home members. And because of the hardening of the border between the United States and Mexico, and the externalization to the Guatemala-Mexico border that Noel was speaking about, now migrants have increasingly come to refer to the United States as the cage of gold, la jaula de oro, because once you're in, you're making so much money that you can't afford to fly back and see your family members, even if someone in your family is dying, because you will be forced to do the very dangerous route again. So it's not just a question of forced immobility in the country of origin, but also a question of forced immobility in the country to which you have, in that case, successfully migrated. So in the remaining time, I wanted to give credit to some of the indigenous language translators who are doing incredible work in US immigration courts. Normally, I write journalism about other people's scholarship, or when I finished my own work, I'll kind of write a story about what I've done. I wrote a story about Guatemalan adoptees for Harper's a couple of years ago based on my dissertation research. In this case, it was the opposite. I had the opportunity to write for the New Yorker magazine about indigenous language access and the kind of crisis during the Trump administration. Many people in this country don't know that a lot of the families that were forcibly separated at the border were not just Guatemalan, but indigenous language speaking Guatemalan. And in speaking to Lee Gallant of the ACLU, he pointed out that this was a question of language justice as well as a question of racial discrimination, okay? And so something that, again, people who don't know Guatemala as well might not realize is that there is such fierce racial discrimination within Guatemalan society that many indigenous language speakers who are imperfectly bilingual or not bilingual at all, there are many monolingual indigenous language speakers in Guatemala, which is a major difference with Mexico, for example, or kind of the in broad strokes. Many people, because of the racial discrimination within Guatemala, will not be willing to say that they don't speak Spanish. So will struggle through an official interview or any kind of contact with the state in a language in which with which they speak imperfectly. So we know from some of these cases of child separation that it was an inability to articulate that someone was your son or daughter, and some misunderstandings around translation that led to some of these separations. And once families are separated, it makes it much more difficult to reunite them. So some of the ongoing difficulties are related to that as well. So Osvaldo is, the reason I was able to use his photograph and his name in the story is that he's regularized his paperwork. We would never do that with an undocumented person. Obviously, the most important thing about scholarship and journalism is to do no harm, obviously. But Osvaldo really wanted to put these issues out there and have the broader audience in the United States know about the 22 indigenous languages and the lack of access. And so one thing that I was able to do in the story was connect some of the genocidal massacres in Guatemala, and this is where I'm going to end my presentation, to the kind of ongoing harm now. And I want to be really clear with those in the room. This is a moral question and a historical question. This is unfortunately not a legal question, right? You do not gain access to asylum rights in the United States under our current laws, with which I deeply disagree, and then also participate as an expert witness in asylum cases, as I'm sure Noelle does as well. So you can kind of strongly disagree and also be trying to help people move through this horrendous system. But past harms in the 1980s do not count, but ongoing discrimination as a member of a targeted indigenous group does. So the first thing I do when I get on the phone with an immigration lawyer who's working on a case is I say, have you asked your client if they speak a language other than Spanish? Because you would hope that immigration lawyers would know about this, but some of them don't, right? So there have been a couple cases in which I've been involved, and I'm not saying this to talk about my work, right? We're all doing this. We're all doing expert witness work. And most people who work on Guatemala cases, that's the first thing that they say to the lawyers. And most of the lawyers know about this by now because there's been such an influx of Guatemalans in recent years. The last statistics from the US's own Department of Justice put MAM, the language that's spoken in Todos Santos Cuchumatan, of the top 10 languages, together with French, Arabic, major world languages, top 10 languages spoken in U.S. immigration court. Okay, so this is a problem of massive scale. So the lawyers now tend to know. What they don't know to ask, and what we can kind of do in some of our expert witnessing work, is to connect the harms, the current harms, back to some of these historical harms in the 1980s, of which the United States was a participant. And again, this is a moral claim that I'm making, not like something that has a legal standing. So how much time do I have left? Very briefly, I should have looked at the time before I began speaking. But what's important to know is that there was a 36-year civil war in Guatemala that lasted from 1960 to 1996. It was a very complex conflict. It was a Cold War proxy conflict. It was a local battle over land. It was a corrupt grab at oil resources. I mean, this was a multifaceted conflict. But one of the most important facets was that it was an outlet for kind of anti-indigenous fury of the kind that we have not seen in any other conflict in the Americas, and certainly not in the 20th century. So indigenous activists in Guatemala will pose the genocidal violence of the 1980s as a kind of continuation of the 500 years of violence since conquest, and rightly so, but it's a massive escalation. So the two truth commissions in Guatemala found after the conflict that 200,000 people had died as part of the conflict, that the primary perpetrator was the state. It was the police, military, and death squads set up by the military that had perpetrated 93% of the violence, right? With the Leninist Marxist guerrilla fighters being responsible for the remaining part. And that 83% of the victims of the conflict were Maya indigenous, 83%. Furthermore, the Truth Commission found that genocidal acts had been committed against certain indigenous groups in the early 1980s. So this is a really important context. Some of the massacres that took place against indigenous language speakers in Guatemala took place in Todos Santos Cuchumatan. So these are historical photographs of people mobilizing against military incursions into their villages. There were scorched earth campaigns of a kind that were inspired by the Vietnam War. And the United States was an actor in this conflict. We were funding the Guatemalan genocidal military to the tune of $500,000 to $1 million per day during the conflict. So the two countries that received the most US military funding during the Cold War were El Salvador and Guatemala. And so these spaces are still, this is a photograph of the kind of main square of Todos Santos in 1982, taken by an American photojournalist. And this is a photograph that I took in 2019. So these spaces look very much the same. There were areas in which, very public violence against indigenous people were perpetrated in the downtown areas of Todos Santos, Cuchumatan. So part of what I'm trying to do with my new research is to inform the asylum work, certainly, but also as a historical matter, to line up some of the kind of present harms with the historical damages in order to make people in the United States aware of our complicity in the genocide and also complicity in the circumstances which set off the Civil War in the first place in the 1960s. So famously, the CIA backed a coup in Guatemala in 1954 that overthrew the democratically elected government. So that's a kind of land the presentation all the way in the past, because part of what I'm trying to do is help explain the present by just being one of many people who's trying to make indigenous migration to the United States more visible, but also link it to these kind of deeper pasts in the country. And I want to end on a note of joy, right? Because it's not just genocide and harm that I want to talk about here. This is a festival in Todos Santos, Cuchumatan, that many migrants, if they are able to return, will return on purpose for the Festival of the Horses. And what this represents is a story that goes back to colonial times in which mom speakers stole the horses that belonged to the Spanish colonizers and rode them up into the beautiful hills surrounding Todos Santos to escape the colonizers. So I did want to say some of the interviews that I've started with deportees have been very painful. Others have contained a lot of joy upon being able to return to the home community and escape the cage of gold in the United States. So it's a kind of complex picture that I'm seeing, and not something that I want to make sound rosy or sugarcoat, certainly, but I just wanted to add that note as a kind of endpoint for this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Katia, and today I will be talking about the criminalization of NGOs engaged in search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. And I'm going to look at the case study of Italy. And I will be providing a legal perspective of a part of the migrants' journeys. So I will start with a very brief introduction and then explain the measures criminalizing NGOs and then the judicial responses, and provide a very short conclusion. As you can see from this map, between 2021 and 2022, there were about 102,000 migrants who adopted the Central Mediterranean route to join the south coast of Italy. And this has been the route that has seen the highest number of arrivals by sea. These migration flows are mixed in the sense that they include both refugees and economic migrants. And the issue of how to address these flows has divided the EU and its member states for many years, and no solution has been reached so far. There is an absence of coordinated search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. And as a consequence, a number of NGOs felt compelled to fill this gap with their own vessels. And between 2015 and 2028, the NGOs have played a very important role in SAR operations, to the point that the Italian Coast Guard came to rely upon them quite regularly. And it's estimated that between 2015 and 2022, NGOs rescued about 233,000 migrants. However, then in 2017, there has been a change of attitude towards NGOs, and NGOs started being accused of being a pull factor of irregular migration and also of cooperating with traffickers. And at the moment, there are still ongoing disputes on where NGO vessels should disembark the rescued migrants and also about the role and regulation of NGOs. So the question that I'm addressing in the research that I'm doing is what are the challenges that sea migration in the Central Mediterranean poses to the rule of law? And one of the sub-questions that I'm going to address today is what are the rule of law challenges concerning SAR NGOs activities in Italy? I have decided to adopt a rule of law lens to study the problem because it allows to study not only legislation, but also the dynamics and features of the institutions of the state. And it's a new approach because most of the scholarship so far has looked at the issue from the point of view of international law or human rights. And the rule of law, I think, is a richer concept that allows to look also at issues that include the separation of powers, the fact that authorities shall be bound by law, the fact that laws shall be accessible, clear, and general, that courts must be accessible and independent, and also fundamental rights shall be protected. So the main piece of legislation that has been used in Italy to criminalize NGOs has been Article 12 of Legislative Decree 286 of 1998, of also called Testo Unico sull'Immigrazione or Unified Text on Immigration, or TUI. This article criminalizes the aiding and abetting of irregular immigration, and it implements both European legislation against trafficking and smuggling, and also the UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime and its protocols. And therefore, this piece of legislation is very much focused on the fight against organized crime. In particular, this article has a very, very wide scope, and it punishes anyone who promotes, directs, organizes, finances, or carries out the transport of foreigners into the territory of the state, or carries out acts aimed at illegally procuring their entry. It also provides for greater severity of the sentence in cases of aggravated circumstances, which includes when the number of foreigners exceed 5, or international means of transport have been used, such as NGO vessels, or forgery legal documents have been used, or there is an intent to profit. So as you can see, the intent to profit is not a constitutive element of the crime, and therefore it exposes humanitarian actors to the risk of criminalization as they're faced with the conflicting legal provisions. On the one side is Article 12, and on the other, the legal obligation to save and rescue people in distress at sea. And the element of profit, it's imposed by European legislation, but in this respect, European legislation is stricter than the UN legislation, which requires the element of the crime as a constitutive part of the action. Also, this article is in contrast with the rehabilitative function of criminal law, which relies on criminal intent as required by the Italian constitution. And again, it creates conflicting legal provisions. And also the aggravating circumstances do not comply with the principle that requires them to be balanced against attenuating circumstances, again, creating conflicting legal provisions. But what is also concerning is that Article 12 has been, in some cases, applied together with Article 416 of the Penal Code, which is about the crime of criminal association, when 3 or more persons come together to commit 1 or more crimes. So there has been a tendency to investigate these crimes together, And one of the consequences is that the competence to investigate is with the district prosecutor, where also some of the anti-mafia bodies are located. And also another interesting aspect is that Article 12 of TUI, Article 416, and here I also included Article 416 bis of the Penal Code, which criminalizes mafia crimes, are all subject to some of the same criminal procedure provisions, which provide for extended timelines for the investigations, but also more investigative powers to the prosecutors. So the problem has been that these anti-mafia security and preventive measures have been used for a completely different purpose for which they were intended. Between 2017 and 2019, Sicilian prosecutors launched a number of investigations against NGOs, and I haven't found any official numbers, but from the secondary sources, it looks like there were at least 4 in 2017, 5 in 2018, and 9 in 2019, and 4 remain pending. In most proceedings, the vessels were seized, and therefore NGOs could not continue with their activities. And some vessels were subject to more than one proceeding in relation to different SAR operation. However, most cases were discontinued by the same prosecutors who started the cases because there was no evidence of the crimes. And no NGO has so far been convicted. Only one case regarding the Juventa vessel reached the trial stage. Some scholars in this regard have talked about an abuse of power on the part of the Italian prosecutors and talked about prosecutorial populism. Also because of, in Italy, there is the principle of mandatory prosecution on one side, but on the other, it has been commented that the will of the prosecutor to investigate these cases went show really a willingness to pursue them. The judicial response has been to reintroduce the rule of law in Italy, because the judges, yes, they have found the existence of the crimes on the part of the NGOs by applying Article 12, because it doesn't require the intent to profit. But on the other side, they have found the justifications for such actions. So the judges said that these NGOs acted to exercise a right or fulfillment of a duty, or in a situation of state of necessity. So one of the interesting cases was the open arms case, where the judge said that this obligation to rescue on the part of NGOs and the application of state of necessity existed not only when the migrants were in distress at sea, but also to prevent that the Libyan Coast Guard would intervene and bring the migrants back to Libya. The most important case has been the case of the High Court of Cassation, which is the highest court in Italy, that concerned the case of Captain Carol Rackete of Sea-Watch 3, where the judge found that the obligation to rescue includes also disembarking the rescued people to a safe place. And a safe place means a place where migrants are physically safe and their fundamental rights guaranteed. The government tried to argue that as the migrants were on the vessel, they were already in a safe place. But the judge said a vessel cannot be considered a port of safety because it remains at the mercy of adverse weather conditions and doesn't guarantee fundamental rights. It's not possible to make an application for international protection. So the conclusion is that the case law established that the duty to save lives at sea prevails over the interest of protecting national borders. And in case of conflict between Article 12 and Article 54, which is about the state of necessity, the second prevails. So the conclusion is that the principles of separation of powers, legality, legal certainty, and compliance with fundamental rights have all been affected in this context. But the rule of law has been reestablished by the courts. And the courts have adopted a perspective focused on rights of migrants. However, this is not the end of the story, because today I just focus on the criminalization of NGOs as a response to this line of decisions. The Italian government then has adopted a number of administrative measures to try to prevent NGOs from disembarking. But I don't have time to discuss them now. I'm happy to answer the questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully people have a little bit of attention span left. I'll try to keep it somewhat brief. My name is Eric Reedy. I am the migration editor for an online news outlet called The New Humanitarian. We're sort of a niche publication focusing on humanitarian crises around the world. And my presentation today might be a little bit scattershot and all over the place. I'm trying to connect the dots between reporting that I've done at a number of different borders, both the US-Mexico border and then also various borders around Europe. And I just returned Tuesday night from a 2-week reporting trip to the US-Mexico border, where I sort of traveled the whole length of the Texas-Mexico border, stopping in different places along the way. And so a lot of what I'm sort of currently thinking about is the situation there. And so this is a photo of the informal refugee camp that has reemerged in Matamoros, Mexico, across the border from Brownsville, Texas. It was the first stop on my reporting trip here. And when I entered the camp, I sort of had this moment where like my whole body sagged into itself, because the sights, the sounds, the smells, everything was just incredibly familiar from, you know, however many of these similar type camps that I've been in different locations, and that sort of continued across the border. This is a photo of one of the shelters in Reynosa, which is sort of the next border town over, and the translator I was working with, the person who was showing me around to these locations, referred to this as the Ritz-Carlton of shelters in Reynosa. So that just sort of gives you a sense of what the conditions are. And then this is also in Reynosa. This is a camp that is on a private land. One of the people in Reynosa is sort of letting asylum seekers stay here. There are a lot of things that are somewhat questionable. Reynosa, there's a very large cartel presence in Reynosa, and so there are a lot of things that are sort of questionable in terms of, you know, what people's motivations are for providing help. And then also one of the things that was really evident on this trip also was just the extreme level of vulnerability that people are living in, and then also the amount of power that people who are providing shelter have. And with a lot of power also comes abuse of power. And in terms of conditions, I mean, the conditions in the camp are very similar to conditions that I've seen in other places also. You have a tiny number of toilets for a large number of people. In the case of the first camp in Matamoros, there were like 1,000 people living there, and there were maybe 6 toilets and no showers. And so people had built sort of makeshift shower tents for themselves that were serving as communal showers and sort of taking bucket baths in these showers. And you see all sorts of attendant humanitarian issues that arise from this. You see scabies, you see lice, you see people with injuries that they sustained along their journeys, not getting adequate medical care. You see a lot of issues with feet, and you see people with chronic diseases, and issues that they sort of came into this setting with, not being able to, access medication, et cetera. So there's all sorts of humanitarian issues. And then as part of the vulnerability that exists, you also see sexual violence and exploitation. You see cartel exploitation. You see kidnappings. You see all sorts of things in these camps. And for me, one of the important things as a journalist doing this reporting, there's a lot of conversation about migration crises. But the frame that I tend to take in my reporting is that when looking at it from the perspective of humanitarianism, the crisis is not migration itself, but it's the humanitarian suffering that's caused by the policies that are put in place to try to limit people's mobility. And I think in all of the camps that I'm sort of going to run through right now, that's sort of the through line in all of these places, is you see people living in situations of extreme vulnerability and humanitarian suffering because of migration policies that have been put in place to try to limit mobility. So how did I come to start writing about migration? I think, like a couple of other people on the panel, it was not really my intention setting out. In 2014, 2015, I was living in Tunisia, reporting on sort of post-Arab Spring political developments in the country. But also 2014, 2015 was sort of the moment that the Mediterranean migration crisis, if you will, emerged into global attention. And Tunisia is right next door to Libya. And so a lot of people were departing from Libya and arriving in Italy. One day I was on a reporting trip in the south of Tunisia, reporting on nothing related to migration. And I was supposed to meet with the head of the Tunisian Red Crescent in the governorate that borders Libya. And I called him on the phone in the morning just to confirm our appointment before I drove to meet him. And he said, "Look, I'm really sorry I can't meet you anywhere. I said I was going to meet you because a boat was rescued last night, and they've been taken to the port of Zarzis, which is a port city right next to Libya in Tunisia. And I have to go there and sort of make sure everybody's okay and make sure they have blankets and hygiene and are getting basic medical care. So we can either postpone our meeting or you can come meet me at the port." And so being a journalist, I was like, okay, this sounds interesting and is not something that I've been focusing on. So let's go to the port. And I think that the reason why I include this slide is I was very much, I think, maybe like a lot of people at that point in time, I was very much focused on sort of the Arab Spring narrative and the post-Arab Spring development. So when I walked into this port in Tunisia and the doors of this warehouse were open and there were, around 100 people sitting inside and their blue jeans were lined up outside, still wet from, the sinking dinghy that they had been traveling in earlier that day, drying in the sun. It was really this moment of awakening, reckoning of there's something going on here, and that's what pulled me in. And this is a picture of Ramadan Mohammed Arte, who is an 18-year-old Somali, and this is just a clip from the article that I wrote. Ramadan Mohammed Arte, an 18-year-old Somali, sat against a warehouse wall at the port in the southern Tunisian town of Zarzis. A collection of blue jeans was spread out next to him, drying in the late morning sun. "We were afraid to die," Arte said of the March incident, even though he says he had prepared himself for such a possibility before he began the dangerous journey from Somalia more than a year ago. So that was sort of my first exposure and interaction with reporting on migration, and that interaction, I still remember my conversation with Ramadan like it was yesterday, and just sort of, he was sitting there after experiencing this incredibly traumatic moment, and just had this smile on his face still, even though he had no idea what was going on or what was going to happen to him. And so that was sort of, I don't know, that's just something that's sort of stuck with me, is the humanity and the way that people are able to preserve their dignity despite living in these types of conditions. So from there, this is a photo of a camp in Idomeni, Greece, on the border between Greece and Macedonia in April 2016. So this is shortly after the signing of the EU-Turkey deal that sort of ended the 2015 moment where you had more than 1 million people cross the Mediterranean, sort of convinced Turkey to start enforcing migration controls along its borders to some extent. And what you saw happen overnight, essentially, Macedonia closed its border, and you had, at that point, you had thousands of people a day landing on the Greek islands who were then traveling through Greece, and not necessarily easily, but with relative freedom of movement, being able to move to Western Europe and arrive in Germany. And overnight, essentially, Macedonia decided to close its border. And you had a refugee camp of 10,000 people spring up on either sides of the train tracks that people had been traveling along. And this was a couple of months after the refugee camp had sprung up. And again, sort of keeping with that theme of it is the policies that are creating the humanitarian suffering. There were stories of tuberculosis in this camp. There were women who were giving birth inside of tents. And again, there was a lot of sexual violence reported. And one of the people I met here, his name was Bashir, a 72-year-old Syrian Kurd from the town of Kamishli in Syria. He had been living in Idomeni since the middle of February with his wife and 2 daughters and a nephew. Another daughter, 21, was separated from the family during their chaotic escape from to the Lebanese border after their house was destroyed by a tank shell. The 21-year-old daughter is now living with a distant relative in Damascus while her family is stuck in Idomeni. I speak with her and she cries. She says, "Mom, Dad, why did you leave me?" Bashir told me. He has 7 other children who are already in Europe. They're all educated with university degrees. And again, it was sort of the sense that this man was retaining his dignity despite having lived in this camp for so long. I met them when they were dragging firewood across the ground to build a cooking fire. And he wouldn't let me leave without sitting and eating like the meal of chicken and rice they cooked, which was it was a really moving experience for me because just the juxtaposition of like the hospitality being offered in this case, and then the closed border and the humanitarian suffering that was causing. Again, a similar situation to what I saw at the US-Mexico border. Ventimiglia, which is a border town between Italy and France, and it's on the dividing line between two founding members of the European Union on a border that isn't supposed to exist. But what you've seen since 2016, 2017 is using emergency declarations of emergency put in place after the Charlie Hebdo shooting and the Bataclan shootings, that border checks have basically been put in place at this border, but they only apply to certain people. So if I'm riding the train from Ventimiglia to Menton, which is like right next to Monaco, it's this incredibly like ritzy, fancy tourist town on the French Riviera. Nobody looks at me twice. But if there's someone who looks like a Sudanese or a Syrian refugee or asylum seeker, the French police board at the first stop over the border, and they come in, they pull everybody off the train. They check people's documents only if they look suspicious, which is clearly racial profiling, and then pull people off the train and just send them back to people who don't have the right passport or the right visa, send them back to Ventimiglia, where they live under a bridge, sort of on the outskirts of town. And again, the very, very similar conditions to what I ended up seeing in Matamoros and Reynosa. Let's see, getting the pinwheel of death here. Okay, again, Lesbos, Greece, very similar situation. Lesbos started as a camp right around the time that the EU-Turkey deal was signed as well, and it was initially a closed camp where you weren't able to access. The first time I was at Lesbos was April 2016, right when the first deportations were supposed to take place under the EU-Turkey deal. And at that time, you had a Pakistani asylum seeker who attempted to commit suicide in the camp because he was being kept in a isolation chamber, being having been scheduled for deportation. And that's something that you also have seen sort of continue over time in a lot of these settings is attempted suicides or suicides because of the desperation and the threats of deportation. And the story of Moria is has already been touched on a little bit, but it continued from 2015 until 2020. So 5 years. And the last time I was there, which is when these photos were taken, there were more than 13,000 people living in this camp, and it could no longer be a closed detention center because it had spilled out of the fences that were meant to contain it. And so people were building shelters out of tarps, out of tree poles. You also saw sort of amazing things where Afghan women had dug ovens into the ground and were baking Afghan bread. But I mean, the conditions were just horrendous. And I think we all know how this ended with the fire in September 2020. And so that catches us up to the recent trip to the US-Mexico border again. And these were some photos that I took in Matamoros. The picture, what is that on your left? Is the Mexican immigration detention center where the fire happened on March 27th and where at least 39 people were killed. And just across the street from that, there was sort of an informal camp of people sleeping on the sidewalk in tents, sometimes just under tarps. And then obviously the last photo there is of the Rio Grande for what it is in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, and sort of the border fortification that exists there. And there were a couple of interesting takeaways from the recent trip. One, in terms of thinking about the way that policies that limit mobility sort of foment these humanitarian crises at borders. The first time I was at the US-Mexico border doing some reporting was 2018, which was just when the metering policy was put in place, which was CBP stationing officers at the center point of the bridges and not letting people approach ports of entry in order to claim asylum, which is when you started to see a backup of people in northern Mexican border cities and the need for increased shelter capacity, which eventually was outstripped and resulted in camps like the ones in Matamoros and Reynosa. And now, talking to people at the border, one of the really interesting things that came up is a lot of people who are providing humanitarian support in that context, their entry point was really 2018, 2019. And they came into that as sort of a moment of crisis, either not thinking about the long term or sort of thinking that if we advocate, if we provide a response, if we take care of this temporary situation, at some point the Trump administration, because it was the Trump administration at that point, won't be there anymore. And the policies are going to go back and you're not going to see this situation. Now, on this visit, I was there 3 years into the Biden administration. I think I'm doing that math correctly. 3 years into the Biden administration, and the camp in Matamoros specifically had been cleared and then reemerged under the Biden administration. It seemed like the situation at the border was sort of at this transition point from sort of people looking at it as a short-term crisis to it now being, unfortunately, the new status quo in northern Mexican border cities. And I think that has a lot of implications in terms of like what the humanitarian response is, because responding to a short-term crisis versus, this being the de facto reality that we're now living with at the border, I think are two very different things. And the big thing that was happening when I was visiting all of these cities is CBP has released a cell phone application called CBP One, which is sort of the evolution of the metering and the MPP policies, which is it's basically an application that, to put it generously, allows people to apply for asylum from northern Mexican border cities. And you sort of saw two different things. There are a small number of people who are able to actually apply for asylum through the app and enter the US, which doesn't guarantee anything in terms of their actual processes. So some people I spoke to on the border were saying that compared to MPP or compared to Title 42 or the years during the during the pandemic when nobody was really able to cross the border and claim asylum in the US, this is an improvement because at least people have some hope in these border cities. But then on the other hand, you have people saying this is the normalization of, you put in these draconian policies, you strand people in these situations of extreme vulnerability. And then you say, okay, but here is like a very narrow legal pathway for a certain number of you to enter. So it's the normalization of this situation. And what it means for asylum seekers and migrants is, there are a very small number of lucky people who, a week or two or three, they might be able to get an appointment, but for the vast majority, and there are tens of thousands of people in these border cities living in similar conditions to the ones that I have shown. For the vast majority of people, they're there for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. It's a prolonged period of limbo where they're sort of suffering all of these vulnerabilities. Yeah, and that was pretty shocking. And I think the image that will stick with me is the app comes online at 10 a.m. EST, 9 a.m. Mountain, 8 a.m. West Coast, I guess. And at that moment, every asylum seeker in each of these cities is standing there with their cell phones, holding it in their hand. And, I think to me, like an expression of the level of desperation is, they're holding it up to the air as if that is going to help them catch a better signal or something like that. They're tracing it across the sky. They're, as if like this hand motion is going to be their deliverance. It's going to give them a better opportunity to have their application be accepted in order to receive a date. And one of the most moving things that I saw when I was there is one man actually receiving his getting a date to enter the US when he was using the application, and the guttural whoop of joy that he let out. And he ran into the street and he was jumping up and down and like dancing with a friend. It was just this moment of like pure joy and relief. And to me, that spoke immensely about the extreme conditions that people are living in, and just the precarity and the vulnerability and how much they've been through. And yeah, I think that's where I'll stop the presentation for now, and I'm looking forward to question and answer.
Thank you. I really want to thank, without taking too much time, each and every one of you for your deep presentations that were just incredible. But I also want to thank you as a panel for how amazingly you spoke to each other's presentation, not just across borders and borderlands and comparatively to different border spaces, but also across disciplines, which is really one of the objectives of the Center of Forced Displacement at BU, and really something that we love seeing. And today, if I've ever seen it, it's been one of the most amazing examples of that. But for the sake of time, we are going to take a few questions, combine them together, and then maybe we can continue a conversation over lunch. Yes.
So this is absolutely amazing. I was texting Marina and Isabella. I had another meeting, but I said stay here. So my question, and Isabella, please combine as you see fit. What happens in case of an acute event? So somebody who has a life-threatening event, in case of a complication in pregnancy, right? So we know that there's basic care available, but in case of an absolutely acute life-threatening emergency, is there any mechanism that addresses that? Or, I mean, or people end up sort of not making it. And is that sort of who navigates that? Who controls that? Is it completely ad hoc? Or is there, in case of an acute emergency, there is some mechanism, some kind of a red button that gets pressed? And then again, anybody can answer, but I think there'd be other questions also. Thank you.
Thank you.
There you go. There's one more. I think there may be some in chat.
Yeah, I was, I have so many questions. I also have to go pick up my passport because I finally have a visa, so talking about it. But I really appreciate the joy came up in, a lot of these talks, and I think it's so easy to fall into that almanac of the miserable, right? And forget, these moments of joy. So I just, a note of appreciation for that. And, on this note of like, immobility. I was wondering whether there were moments of mobility or heightened speed for certain groups, and just thinking from the perspective of like enforcement, border enforcement as being filtration rather than just restriction. And so where like maybe it's the researchers who are able to come in and out, or any other actors who are, you know, sort of interacting with those same spaces, same border zones, but actually have speed of access and mobility alongside that.
Maybe we can answer these two and then see what time we have left.
Great. Maybe just briefly, I'll start and then others are gonna have something to say on it. The person who can push the red button before you're in the kind of spaces that Eric was just talking about is the coyote, is the human smuggler. So you are really at the mercy of the person who is burying you, and it's often more than one person. It's not as if one person accompanies you from Los Santos all the way up to the US-Mexico border. You may start out with a non-speaking human smuggler. You may end up with a Spanish-speaking human smuggler who doesn't understand what's happening medically. A birth would be a little more obvious, but there's some other medical conditions that the language access becomes a problem even before you're hitting immigration courts. And then in terms of speed for certain groups, absolutely, people who are white are okay. I mean, it's like a kind of obvious answer, but in the same kind of profiling way that Eric was just talking about, I've heard many accounts and seen many examples of people who don't look indigenous, don't look Afro, Honduran, being treated quite differently, and the difference is often steep. And then once you're in the asylum court, there's the opposite dynamic where you really want to slow things down because speed is the enemy. So it's like once you're across the border, it kind of switches.
Thank you for those questions. The context is a little bit different, but I will, and that's why I'm going to say these two things that kind of tweak your questions. Red button in the context of that I was describing are your informal networks with people you encounter. So you often times end up in the hospital because the person who works with EOM is actually a local who knows a doctor who is actually working that shift, and you end up being taken care of oftentimes by the local Red Cross and not necessarily EOM, European kind of presence on the ground. So the red button in itself is a site of informality oftentimes, so people just care for others. And in so many instances, I witnessed people being taken by a translator or by, somebody who was at the same playground with the kids were playing. So it kind of follows the same logic of this seemingly illogical encounter. So red button, these familiarities that you develop with the local community. And the other one, and you also stay in the hospital using mechanisms of intentionally, let's say, intentionally tricking the system by giving either a diagnosis or something so the person can stay longer injured, even though they're undocumented. They're invented as a new person in a particular hospital unit. So there are many ways in which the kind of the hidden scripts are used to take care of people. The heightened speed, one thing that you made me think about is that infrastructures that allow for time to be conquered faster were developed from the center, in this case of the country, to send the people out of the center to the border towns. So the train that never worked in post-war period suddenly, miraculously started working only during the so-called migrant crisis, and it's not working anymore now that the sites have shifted. So suddenly a train is working, bringing migrants to the border, right? In order to take them from the capital to the border towns. So
This is an interesting way in which internally the states are redistributing infrastructurally certain populations to border cities.
Yes, I want to build on something that you just said, which was mentioning the role of informality and care in specific. And I think it's important to point out that this filtration system is both racialized, as we discussed at the border of Italy and France, but it's also gendered. And so that care work inevitably falls unequally and tends to be coded as a form of women's work. And that begins long before a migrant journey, as we're dealing in El Salvador in the context of mass incarceration. El Salvador just surpassed the United States with its incarceration rate. For example, you see a massive fragmentation of urban landscapes where men are viewed as potential threats by both police and competing gangs, more now than ever police. And so their mobility across the city is in fact more constrained than women. And so ever more that burden of mass incarceration and the burden of immobility suffered by refugees and migrants is being borne by women's work.
Yeah, in terms of the red button, this is particularly related to the what I was just seeing at the U.S.-Mexico border. I think there is no official red button. The Mexican Constitution guarantees healthcare access regardless of migration status. However, you do actually see a number of informal barriers to accessing that care. So the red button, if something happens at camp in Matamoros or Reynosa or Ciudad Juarez, the hospitals in those respective cities would be sort of the places that people would go. But in Reynosa specifically, I was hearing about the hospital in Reynosa not having the medical, the medicines or the medical equipment necessary to treat the local population of Reynosa, let alone 10,000 asylum seekers who are stranded in the city. And then also, in some ways, these networks, these informal networks that that provide support in these settings are heartwarming because you see average people, normal people, doing extraordinary things in these moments. But at the same time, not everybody has access to those networks, and those networks are not comprehensive enough to cover everybody's needs. So you see tons of people falling through the gap, and it comes down to a matter of luck, more or less, whether you can actually access those networks, which is, that's a big gamble when you're talking about things like medical emergencies. And on the question around sort of the way that like racial bias works in terms of access. The U.S.-Mexico border, Ukrainians and asylum seekers are a perfect example of this, where the Ukrainian asylum seekers were given privileged access to the U.S. through humanitarian parole for several months last year before a whole separate program was put in place. I mean, I saw sort of a shocking number. I can't remember exactly what it was, but something like 250,000 plus Ukrainians have been able to enter the U.S. Through legal pathways since the beginning of the Russian invasion last year, which on one hand is a feel-good story because people should be able to access protection, but then you think about all of the people who have been blocked from accessing protection during that same time period. So the sort of the duality of that system that exists is pretty shocking. And I've also seen this, that's a very outright example of it, but looking at the European context, even there where there are a lot of policies in place to limit people's mobility and access to protection, there's also a hierarchy of asylum seekers that, sort of exists within the asylum bureaucracies and sort of public opinion. So in 2015, 2016, Syrians were looked at as legitimate asylum seekers. And then you can sort of go down the list from there and say, okay, Iraqis, maybe, Eritreans, who knows, Pakistanis, definitely not, and people's treatment in these spaces, was very much dictated by those perceptions, which, as we all know, asylum law is all about like individual case, evaluation, not national identity. So.
Thank you. And please, you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
and I have the mic.
Yeah, so there you go.
I was so struck through these wonderful presentations with how self-consciously you were thinking about your position as researchers and writers. And I would love if anyone, all of you, would reflect on how you came to that position and how you, I guess, incorporate it in your writing and research, if you can, or if you find that's really difficult given academic writing structures or even the kinds of genres that journalism undertakes in the case of Eric. And many of you also, I noticed, are writing in multiple genres or crossing between academia and journalism. And is that one reason that you are so much more thoughtful about your positions? Yeah.
I could say briefly, I mean, anthropologists classically do this. It's not like outside the bounds of normal academic work, but I try really not to write about myself in most of my stories because I think I'm the least interesting person, generally speaking. So I have a set of internal guidelines about when I do it. When my presence as an obviously white person is affecting what's happening in the room, it's my responsibility to write about it because that's part of the story that I'm telling. So if I'm sitting in a courtroom, sometimes my presence will kind of affect what's happening. But if it's for the worse, I'm not going to be sitting there, right? But if it's kind of a judge who's more inclined to be lenient in certain cases or whatever, because someone is watching, I'm often mistaken for an NGO worker when I'm hanging out in Central America, which has its own set of complications, but or a DEA person in other cases, and that's not great. But I try not to dwell on it because it doesn't seem super interesting or relevant, but certainly I do have to establish, I mean, if I'm in writing, I'm not physically embodied the way that I am here sitting in front of you guys, you can easily imagine what my presence is like in a rural Guatemalan community. It's weird. So a lot of people come up to me and say, what are you doing here? And that's the beginning of some conversations that I have. People will come up to me in rural areas of Guatemala speaking flawless English, and I know that there's more deep dive than asking, right? So I do write about it, but not always and not in probably the best ways that I possibly could. Others may have better thoughts on this. Yeah.
I came to the research in migration because I used to work as an immigration lawyer before and then a lawyer. And at some point I decided to change work and career. So in the research that I do, I always try to be careful about not being too biased. And always to integrate the perspective of the state or of other actors involved. And then, of course, I'm free to express an opinion, but I think I have to be very careful about considering all the interests involved. In some of my research, I also do empirical legal research, so I do interviews of actors. So I also work in a department of anthropology. I've learned a lot from anthropologists and a lot about my positionality. So when I interview people, I'm especially conscious if they're vulnerable or if they see or they hope in some way I can help them. There are a number of ethical issues I have to be aware of and also explain the papers I write. In some occasions, it's been quite complicated, especially where I did work in immigration detention. But otherwise, for this project, I decided only to interview experts because it makes things much easier. Yeah, I could talk about this probably for the next hour, but I don't think anyone in this book will appreciate it. I really appreciate your question. It's something I have been grappling with since I found anthropology as an intellectual space for trying to think about the war that I went through, and that I was very unhappy how people wrote about that war. And I found anthropology as one space that allowed me to position myself in a way that would think about how Yugoslavia would fall apart theoretically, while always listening to the people on the ground. I felt anthropology gave me that scope. However, what I was not prepared for, I understood my positionality as a hybrid, right? I'm oftentimes treated as somebody who is too close to it, but maybe sometimes not close enough, meaning that somebody who had to kind of leave Bosnia to acquire Western gaze and to come, so I could actually then see Bosnia in a less biased way. something I'm still grappling with because I deeply embody this grammar now that you now share with me, but I always feel it's slipping, something's slipping, because I have been acquiring it so well, that I feel that now I'm not close enough. So that as a background in this particular piece, the positioning oneself in anthropology since the 60s is not even a question. You have to position yourself, but not everyone is asked to position themselves equally. Women as well, so-called native hybrid anthropologists you're supposed to immediately say, what's the space you're coming from, right? However, how we say where we place ourselves is a political question. And oftentimes I realize that as a woman, as a Muslim woman, I was putting myself always at the end of paragraphs because that's where I knew I had to be in it, but I didn't know how to be in it productively. And this is something that I'm still struggling with, I have no choice but to be in it because the reviewer will say, this is obviously not a native English speaker and this is obviously from there. She has to put herself in. So how do you put yourself in order to be there in a way that doesn't overwhelm the story you're trying to say, but also to be productive, generative, right? I think it's a work in progress, and I'm really struggling with it on a daily basis, and that's why sometimes poetry comes, sometimes an essay comes, sometimes this genre falls apart, and it feels like it's caging, seemingly that which it liberates, which is the voice. So I think about this a lot, and I don't have a good answer, but I'm really, really thankful for you realizing that there is an effort there to try to create that space. And I think to be fair, I should just switch to Bosnian right now. So Eric, želiš nešto reći?
Yeah, I guess for me, since I started reporting on migration, it was just always incredibly evident, the disparity in mobility between myself and the people that I meet and write about. So it was sort of inevitable in that sense that it was something that I had to engage with because here I am flying and walking and driving and crossing borders in all sorts of ways in order to be able to tell these stories, and then talking to people who are literally dying to try to do the same thing, or have people that they love who have died trying to do the same thing. So yeah, that's something that I think sort of inevitably I've had to wrestle with. How it comes up in my writing, I mean, a lot of times writing for the New Humanitarian, I'm the disembodied, the New Humanitarian saw, or something along those lines. So yeah, so I mean, it doesn't come up in everything that I write. I think in terms of like the reflective process and on the systems that are active in terms of shaping people's lives and well-being in moments of mobility. It's definitely there in the background all the time. And then I also, I feel like what I try to do in my writing a lot of the time is, it's a tremendous privilege to be able to go places and see things firsthand and talk to people and, vicariously experience like a certain degree of the emotion that people are going through. And so even when I'm not writing in the first person or I'm not really including myself, I try whatever emotional experience I'm having while doing the reporting, I try to translate that to whoever's going to be reading it through the writing process, trying to evoke some of that emotional response that I've had to get in place through the writing, which I don't know if I'm successful, but that's the attempt.
All right, I bought myself a moment to talk because I think it's really hard to have a short answer to those really important questions. How did I come to that position? I think it was that position that is a deep and personal attempt to understand my place, my position, my complicity in the world that actually brought me to research rather than me coming to that position during the research. And so that's always been a sort of animating and motivating piece of why I do what I do. And then how do I try to incorporate that? One important distinction for me is that I don't study people. I'm not studying you. I'm not studying you. I'm studying the shared practices and structures under which we live in different positions.
And so for me, that's part of it. I'm part of that shared social political space, and I'm studying the space that we inhabit together rather than studying you. And then the third piece of that for me is that I've come to recognize that there are things that I don't want to write, that shouldn't be written, that people shouldn't know, or at least aren't ready to know yet. And I think that's really different from the way many of my journalist friends approach information and knowledge. I don't think the light is always good. I think the shadows are sometimes productive.
And that's what Audra Simpson calls refusal, what I refuse to tell, which I think is a very powerful way to think about position.
Thank you. And on this very deep note, I invite us to continue conversation over lunch, but please, people on Zoom and in person, join me in thanking our panelists for today's presentation. Thank you.
Wait for another panel.
No, for you.
No, I'm afraid, but please be in touch with me, all of you, anyone, be in touch with me, I'm going to.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, but I'm very late for this other thing.